Hello, everyone. My name is Sophie Durbin, and I am a master's student at the University of the Highlands and Islands, Orkney. My research focus is engaging contemporary audiences with the archaeology of the early medieval North Atlantic using digital museum and heritage collections. I am particularly interested in using sensory techniques to tie these areas of inquiry together. Today, I will be sharing with you a portion of my current research, which is very much concerned with the cognitive space that allowed people to experience magic and miracles in the early medieval period. I will share the personal story that inspired my interest in conducting this research, explain the methodology I used for qualitative analysis, and then walk through some notable findings. I will conclude with a summary of the outcomes and recommendations for future research. I am going to back up for a moment and share how the impetus for this study was personal. Here we're still in the pre-modern North, though looking at what is now Russia and not Scotland. The objects you see here are a set of horse trappings made between 300 and 400 AD by the people we now know as the Huns, who were a nomadic people moving across Europe during this time. These objects are held at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, Maryland. The most intense cognitive sensory experience that I have ever had with an object was in response to this simple image you see on the left. In an early medieval art seminar that I took on a whim as an undergraduate, the professor asked us to look at a mysterious set of shiny objects on a PowerPoint slide. After several minutes of staring at the image and taking notes, we came back together to discuss what we noticed. I was immediately struck by the strange visual impact of the image. Majestic but crude, the assemblage was somehow visibly medieval to me. My professor informed us that the objects were a set of Hunnish horse trappings from the 5th century, and suddenly my mind raced. I imagined a group of nomadic raiders riding in a procession through a village they had just conquered. The horse trappings would have glittered as the horses trotted through the crowd, the sound of metallic clanks and horseshoes mixing with the noise of human voices, speaking in the extinct Hunnic language as well as the local tongue. The air would have been thick with the earthy scent of horses, pungent enough to activate the taste buds as well as the olfactory receptors. To the Huns, the horse trappings would have been part of the overwhelming sensory experience of conquest, but to the villagers, the trappings would have played a part in the physical and cognitive experience of their subjugation. Years later, I traveled to Baltimore to see these horse trappings. When I found the objects in person, I realized that while their presence was formidable, the sensory response that I had to them on my original encounter was, in fact, equally valuable. The response that I had to the digital image was a fully formed example of 4E cognition, a model that encompasses the multidimensional quality of the mind and space, a response that was embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended. Using my human senses, I imagined the embodied physical experience of the horse trappings embedded within the photo itself. My observations were enacted as they emerged through the sensory activity of looking, as well as the imagined sensory activities of hearing, touching, and smelling. My cognition was extended through the thoughts that I recorded on paper as I viewed the objects. In other words, I experienced what Mary Carruthers refers to as ductus, a mental journey through the object. Using my senses to interpret the image, I approached viewing the artifacts as medieval audiences might have. As Alfred Gell might say, through these objects, I experienced the technology of enchantment. In this study, I'm bringing about similar experiences in contemporary audiences, or at least attempting to, that enable them to experience enchantment from afar while engaging with the archaeology of early medieval Scotland. I did this research using focus groups, which were conducted as informal participatory workshops. Each focus group examined one of the following remote engagement techniques grounded within a particular sensory framework: slow looking, close reading, deep listening, kinetic experiencing, and mindfulness. Every technique was paired with a particular object or set of objects representative of a group from within early medieval Scotland: Picts, Gaels, Britons, Angles, and Vikings or Norse settlers. By selecting these objects, I attempted to holistically represent the breadth of material and textual culture related during this period. Please note that today I'll only be sharing the data from the slow looking, close reading, and mindfulness groups for the sake of briefness. I used the concept of 4E cognition that I mentioned in my introduction as a measuring stick throughout the study. Though they were remote from the objects, did participants display responses that could be said to be embodied, embedded, enacted, or extended? In my summary of each of the focus groups, I assess how the engagement technique in action represents 4E cognition. The first focus group used slow looking to examine a massive silver chain, likely Pictish, made sometime between 300 and 500 AD. Slow looking, sometimes called close looking, is a deceptively simple technique that asks learners to think critically by focusing for a set period of time on one thing. Participants were asked to look at an image of the Pictish chain from National Museum Scotland while taking notes in silence. The chain is made of a staggering amount of silver for the period and decorated with a few Pictish symbols on the clasp. The participants noticed several features of the chain that suggested its use in ritual processes. One participant guessed at a ceremonial purpose due to the use of silver as a luxury good. After learning that the chains would have been small enough to be worn by a child or a woman, one participant used this information to imagine a coming-of-age ceremony or a betrothal. She imagined one individual draping the chain around another person and then clasping it, comparing this ritual to someone tying a bow tie for someone else or putting an engagement ring on a finger. Another participant wondered if the clasping process may have been metaphorical and suggested that it may have symbolized a marriage or a joining of families. Relating to discussion of the process and the position of the clasp, one participant argued that the Pictish symbols may relate to the bringing together of two things, such as two families. Another shared that if the symbols are to be understood as text, the clasp would likely be in front in order to be legible to a passerby. Considering an alternative view in which the clasp is in the back, the symbols would only be readable by the person clasping the necklace around another person's neck. This could then signify an intimate relationship between the clasper and claspee, or a high status conferred upon the clasper due to their literacy or proximity to the symbols. The group considered how the digital presentation of the object subtly took a stance about how the chain would have been clasped. The dominant scholarly opinion is that the clasp would have been worn on the front based on the position of the symbols. This is likely reflected in the photograph on the museum website. However, participants brought valuable new insights in favor of placing the clasp at the back of the neck, such as the aforementioned intimacy of the clasping process and its relationship with literacy. These viewer insights contribute to an argument in favor of a back clasp position, if only as a new possibility to imagine. In response to this possibility, National Museum Scotland may consider a secondary way of displaying the chains on its website to encourage other viewers to form their own opinions about the clasp position and its meaning. We see here that the simple, slow-looking exercise coaxed participants into complex sensory encounters with the Pictish chains. The themes that the group constructed together through these encounters are reflective of a 4E cognitive model. The viewers imagined the embodied experience of interacting with the chains, including the physical processes that led to their creation, as well as the relationship of the chain to the body as an object of adornment. They considered embedded meanings constructed around the chain as it moves through the world, such as the understanding that a passerby would have had of its materials and their cultural meaning. By considering the ritual and performative processes associated with the chain, the focus group demonstrated an active approach. Finally, while reflecting on the complexity of the clasping process and its relationship to literacy, the group understood how the Pictish symbols extended the cultural meaning of the chain into the realm of legible word and image. In order to approach text as archaeology, I selected close reading as the engagement method for this portion of the study. From a sensory standpoint, close reading is, in essence, a slow-looking activity. But this is complicated by the intake and translation of text into the mind's eye. Recent studies have acknowledged that reading texts can trigger bodily responses across the spectrum of senses. I asked each group member to select one of 3 texts to closely read and analyze one of the following before coming back together for a group discussion. One was a passage from Adamnan's Life of Columba. I also included a chapter from the Orkney Inga saga, as well as a segment from Durbin. One note, while the actual writing of the Orkney Inga saga falls outside of the bounds of the early medieval period, the sagas represent the textual culmination of an earlier indigenous oral tradition. The saga is a case study of how medieval writers constructed their own past. Though Life of Columba and Durbin were indeed written within the early medieval period, they also must be considered critically. How did their authors wish to represent the events portrayed? Whose stories are being told, and to what end? The Orkney Inga saga excerpt was the chapter Earl Harold Slain by Sorcery, in which Earl Harold immediately dies at a Christmas party at Orfer after trying on a magical garment made by his sisters for his brother Paul. The family disperses across Scotland afterward. The focus group participant who read the Orkney Inga saga excerpt took note of the mixed pagan and Christian themes within the text. Based on the chapter title he shared, it seems to me to be this transitional period between pagan sorcery and Christian dogma. He noted that the audience of the text would need to understand sorcery to be a real threat, though they may be practicing Christians themselves. This is consistent with what we know about the gradual and syncretic nature of Christianization in the Viking world. Through a close looking of Orkneyinga saga, the function that magic or sorcery served in the narrative becomes clear. While these phenomena were part of the old religion, they remained everyday occurrences through the long, nonlinear process of conversion. The later medieval audience of the written saga might have reflected on the former significance of sorcery within the Viking Age and the generational impact of these beliefs. Participants also discovered how the texts use storytelling to shape history as it would be remembered by their readers in the context of miracles. The participant who selected Life of Columba was intrigued by the place name history within the passage, which explains the miracle origin of the name Hill of Angels on the Isle of Iona. As one might imagine from the name, a majestic group of angels appear to Columba on a hill. A land surveyor in his everyday life, this participant related the story to the concept of beating the bounds, a custom for establishing land boundaries that he had learned about while studying for his surveying certificate. Here, the participant drew a connection between later English and American communal land management practices and the onomastic folk history of the Hill of Angels. This enlivened the text, bringing the passage off of the page and into the richer global sphere of placemaking across the ages. Edifnon's description of the Hill of Angels, which a contemporary reader may have recognized as a local place, could be said to place the reader in a state of imaginative immersion, in which an author may project his audience or reader into biblical roles and events, according to Eng. Through close reading, this participant entered his own state of imaginative immersion while imagining the miracle essential to this tradition in which Iona has written its own history. Close reading allowed the focus group participants to experience 4E cognition. They developed mental imagery of the textual content using their own embodied experiences. Their responses were embedded in the historical context of the texts, which differed from the historicity that each text purported to convey. The close reading encounters were enacted through the sense of sight and extended through note-taking and the group discussion itself. For the final focus group exercise, I turned back to slow looking as a technique and combined it with mindfulness. What happens when a learner focuses their attention on a distant object through techniques associated with guided meditation? Can this make an encounter more vibrant? I selected this method specifically to have a group analyze the grave goods from Grave 1 excavated at the West Ness Cemetery on Rousey, Orkney, Scotland, beginning in 1968. The grave contains a female skeleton and 2 neonates, alongside a rich assemblage of objects that would have been expensive to manufacture and indicative of a high-status individual. The focus group held in Kirkwall was held at the Kirkwall Hotel, where the windows face the harbor, allowing us to look out toward Rousey as the weather changed from sunshine and wind to horizontal sleet and snow throughout a chilly morning. One classmate was actually unable to attend because the inter-island ferry from Shappensea was not running that day. This was a reminder of the intensity and ever-changing quality of the weather in Orkney, which would have impacted the performance and infrastructure of burial. For the exercise, I first simply shared an image of the brooch pin and asked participants to look at it. Before beginning the exercise, I led them through a brief series of deep breaths. They were asked several simple questions to center them in the present moment with the object. After taking notes, participants noted that the pin looked worn, commenting on the missing stones and signs of handling, and they thought that it was a family heirloom. The participants noticed the intricate design on the pin, with one asking if the design may have been intended for one individual, or if the intertwined animals may have been indicative of a marriage. Another shared that to her the motifs were so detailed that they appeared almost animate, and depending on the light source, they would have flickered in the dark in the flames and glinted against the Orkney sunset. This animacy suggested that the pin was meant for someone of great social status. They considered the metaphorical qualities of placing a family treasure within a grave. One participant referred to the lovely poetry of the family line ending, dying out on that day, and burying the heirloom to symbolically inter the family line. The same participant suggested that maybe the woman dressed up to go into labor, and that the grave goods reflect an initial celebration of life. A high-status labor may have been as important as a high-status burial, and the birth could have been impacted by the apotropaic power of the brooch. The participants' comments were very much in concert with recent assertions that the West Ness Cemetery was not simply a container for static grave sites, but a living site embedded with ancestral memories. The participants' discussion of the brooch pin mapped well onto the 4E cognitive model. Their perception of the brooch was embodied within their knowledge of the experience of living in a body encountering weather and the environment, as well as the ritual processes involved with deposition and burial. Their cognition was embedded within the experience of the woman and neonates who moved through the world in a distinctive Norse settler environmental context. This was enacted through the experience of mindfulness, which asked for participants to use their senses and their awareness of the present moment as a means to access the brooch pin. Their observations were extended through the location-specific discussion, which took place in close proximity to the burial site despite still being remote. In future research, a more sophisticated mindfulness approach would likely include the rest of the grave goods. This approach would be elevated by incorporating the disparate excavation notes, photos, and fragments that currently constitute the public body of knowledge on the West Nest Cemetery. By investigating an entire excavation through mindfulness, the process of archaeology comes into the fore. If the burial at Grave 1 was likely a performance of mortuary drama, so was the excavation itself as it unraveled across the latter decades of the 20th century. On a larger scale, these focus groups also influenced participants' thought processes in the weeks and months that followed. In a post-evaluation shared with participants, 41% offered their thoughts on the question, did the discussion you participated in change your perception of any other remote objects, sounds, or artifacts in the time since the focus group? 100% of the respondents said yes. In their responses, participants appreciated the opportunity to simply slow down, engage in a group discussion, and explore the unique story of each object. They gained perspective on the role of objects in their own lives. If museums and heritage organizations hope to make their collections relevant to the public through digital means, it is in their best interest to remain in conversation with their audiences, possibly by developing discussion guides drawn from the techniques explored here. In the case of early medieval artifacts, these same organizations would be well served to help the public access the medieval mindset that would have activated these objects. Through this path, the global audience may be drawn nearer to encountering enchantment, or at least the cognitive space that makes it possible. Thank you.